Hello, everybody.
Hi, everybody. It's good to see you again. Hi, Penny.
Hello. Good to see you. Almost summer.
Happy summer for those of us who are already there. We join you today with one of our favorite educators, Tom Newkirk. We have both been followers of Tom and Tom's work over the years. And full disclosure, we're pretty good friends. He edited our book, Four Essential Studies. But the reason we asked Tom to come on today and chat with us is because of an article that he recently published called The Broken Logic of Sold a Story, a Personal Response to the Science of Reading. And it has received, I think, some really interesting feedback. And Tom, in this country, there's sort of this idea that the science of reading is this one thing. And I think part of that response is to this idea that if you're not following this one thing, you're not teaching reading correctly. Is that in the ballpark of why you wrote this article?
Well, I wrote the article after I listened to the Sold the Story podcast, which I think summarizes, in a way, a very popularized version of the science of reading case against what's going on in this country. And I think as many people who listened to that podcast felt, it's brilliantly put together. It's the effort that went into that and the music, the interviews, it's deeply moving. But as I listened to it, I said, who is really going to buy this argument? The argument itself didn't hold together. And so I wanted to write something first for myself, just to kind of clarify my understanding of why I felt the argument didn't hold together. And then as I did it, I shared it with people and then decided ultimately to see if I could get it distributed, because I thought it could be part of the conversation. Certainly not the last word, but it seemed to be a response that needed to be made to the podcast and to the general argument that basically reading in this country is being totally mishandled by schools of education and teachers and schools. So that's the reason I did it.
Tom, I see the response to Sold a Story happening right now in schools as we're ending one school year and preparing for the next. They're ordering lots of programs that will solve the problem, right? And many programs, if you've been to a convention lately, have science of reading on them. And as if there's one science and there's one, isn't that kind of what we all wish were true, is that there's one thing we could all do and every kid would read immediately at grade level. And why wouldn't schools do that? But I think you really help us understand how complicated that is.
Well, I mean, the story is so neat, and it's been picked up by journalists. That it has like a problem and has culprits, and I think it's almost like, sometimes when you buy a car, if you have a deal that's too good to be true, it's probably too good to be true, and so it's you need to question it. And I think the way what I see happening, and you folks are in the schools, so you can respond, is that the science of reading is translated into the need to buy programs in phonics. Because phonics, there's just, the claim that there's not enough phonics being taught. And in some places that may be true. But you have, I think, first graders, very young kids, being asked to sit through 20, 30 minutes phonics lessons. And I think if you take a 5-year-old who's been in, say, a play-oriented kindergarten and bring that kid into a first grade where they're asked to attend to a teacher presenting a phonics lesson for 30 minutes, you're just out of touch with the attention ability of 6-year-olds. And it's going to be hard for the 6-year-old. I mean, I can't imagine as a 6-year-old I could have sat through that. And it's going to be hard for teachers who have to maintain that attention. So I think something that has an element of truth to it, that we need to maybe be more intentional about how we teach phonics. I mean, I think but that's translated into these long stretches of time that maybe they may claim that that's aligned with science, the science of reading, but it's certainly not aligned to the science of how kids pay attention, or just the practical knowledge of how kids pay attention. So I think it's going to lead to some real problems.
Yeah, the argument is,
I think it is leading to some real problems.
The argument isn't phonics or no phonics. The argument is how much phonics and when and how long.
Yeah, yeah. And that's a good question. And I
And
think
that's not a universal answer for all kids.
not at all. I mean, you'll have kids come in who are pretty adept to begin with. You'll have kids who will need some introduction to the more stable phonics principles. And then you'll have kids who probably will need much more reinforcement of that, maybe in tutorial sessions. And so you need to differentiate who needs what. And I think if you're talking about whole class, I think it often will work better in shorter spurts, where you might, take a term and maybe work with it for, 5-10 minutes, but not this long stretch of time. So, so I think that it needs to be differentiated. And if it's like every kid has to sit through, not just days, but even years of whole class instruction in phonics, you're going to have kids who don't need it sitting through things that are, where there's a huge opportunity cost where they could be doing other things and should be doing other things.
Well, and in fact, one of those other things that, again, I'm going to reference this incredible article that you've written, which we will post to connect with this talk. But one of the things you talk about is Marie Clay's early work and this connection to kids learn sound symbol correspondence, creating books. And I've watched it with my own granddaughter, like her attention to what's that sound? What am I hearing? And then writing the letter, and how critically important it is that we have kids in bookmaking experiences, not just sitting and rotely learning phonics, that it actually leads to a better understanding of reading.
And a better understanding of phonics, that if you're asking students to sound out words, and I think a lot of us are familiar with the early work in the 1970s and 1980s, where kids were allowed to write using the sounds that they hear in words and create books with invented or transitional spelling. And you would go into classes and it sounds like a phonics factory. I mean, it did. It literally did. That kids are saying the words, and then what words do you hear? What sounds do you hear? How can you get down those sounds? And they'll use endings that they've learned. And so they're really exploring the language, using words that really matter to them. Now, I would argue that that's a more efficient way and a more effective way and a more motivational way to teach phonics than to give phonics worksheets where you have a picture of a pig and says, does it start with P, we've all seen those. So I think that, and one of the amazing things to me is if you read through some of the long research articles from the science of reading that are foundational documents, they virtually ignore all that work in emergent literacy that Marie Clay did, that Glenda Bissix did. I mean, it's not dismissed, it's not even there. And I think that's, and it's partly because, I mean, a lot of the science of reading stuff comes out of a kind of a cognitive educational psychology paradigm. And so like the work of Glenda Bissix is really not in the picture. This work on invented spelling, or how Marie Clay says how kids learn directionality, how they learn how to put spaces between words, at a very young age. And all this stuff contributes to reading, right? It's understanding the print system, but it's pretty much non-existent in the science of reading. There's hardly any talk about writing and how writing contributes to reading. And I think that's a big gap.
It's huge.
Huge.
My granddaughter is in the middle of kindergarten, end of kindergarten now, but about February, March, we started making books when I meet her on Mondays after school, and you will see evidence of all of the things you're talking about. It's not, the inventive spellings are very close. And I think that what you see is she knows books go page after page. She knows what might go on a page. She knows the spacing, but it's because she's been inundated with looking at books and reading books with adults and immersed in all of these books in her room. And I think one of the ways I've heard people talk is sciences of reading. There's more than one. And one of those you touched on, which was engagement. Maisie's not going to stay engaged with 30 minutes of phonics in first grade when she is now reading fluently. And that's not that unusual.
And it's not only that she won't stay engaged, but what will it do for her desire to want to continue reading?
Exactly.
you can, of course, we want every kid to learn phonics, but in a way that won't destroy their love of books.
Mhm, mhm. And I think, again, writing can have a huge play in here because uh, I've gone into first grade classes where they have something called the news of the day, okay? And they will have, and the teacher will write down in simplified form, say, Jesse went to the Celtics game, okay? And the kids will read that along with him. And then the teacher might stop and say, game, can we think of some words that might rhyme with game? And they might write 2 or 3 words, fame, same, so you could embed that in something that has real interest to kids as they write down write down the news of the day. And then they have words that they might want to use because they've already said something about it that's happened to them. So they might use those words then in their writing. So you're reinforcing that. And that's usually just maybe like a 10-minute opening to the day, And I think that's much more purposeful, I think, than to just have separate lessons in phonics. And I think the problem, and I'm not saying that this happens all the time, the problem, I think, when anytime you separate any skill out from the act of doing it, I think there's often a problem with transfer. And so I think, what I've read that a lot of kids who still have trouble with reading had phonics, but they had it in a way that they weren't able to really use it. So I think that's an important thing.
I love how you said that. The problem is the transfer through practice, through engaged practice, right?
Yeah.
That's our big, so I want it for all of the people on here. I'm thinking, a lot of people who follow us, Tom, are high school teachers, and that's been our primary place. I just want to give one example of a short story written by Maisie that's 4 pages long. All right.
Okay.
Oh, title, Everybody's Brain Grows. Right? Now, she doesn't have by Maisie. She usually does. Here's page 2. Brains work in different ways. My brain grows making art.
Wow.
Right? And you can see, even if you're worried about spelling, right? She doesn't know grows, but she's got all the sounds for grows. How does your brain grow? That's it. And when you were talking about this transfer to practice, that is a 15-minute little book she made, staples it up. She knows she can take the staples out and add pages. And it's not complicated, but the amount of thinking that's in those pages. And if you watch her try to figure out how to spell grows, sometimes she asks, sometimes she doesn't. She just takes a shot. And then her little sister comes home, who's going to be 4 in a couple months. And she's immediately like, Lila, let me read you my book. That is exactly the kind of practice we need.
And so when that kid goes to school and is made to sit for a 30-minute one-size-fits-all phonics lesson, therein lies the problem.
Therein lies a lot of problems.
So I want to ask you, Tom, in the article, you do such a good job of connecting. Is there really a reading crisis in our country to a big discussion of poverty and how that impacts schools and kids? And so I thought if you could just say something about that.
This is a little tricky because I don't want to imply that we can't do a better job. And I mean, both of you have worked your entire careers so that we could do a better job. And I've tried as well. So it isn't a call to be complacent. And certain kids have struggled, but they struggle in all kinds of reading programs, But when I was reading, when I was listening to the podcast and reading, and generally, anytime you see anybody promote the science of reading, they start out with some claim that there is a reading crisis, that failure to adhere to the science of reading will correct. So, I mean, the notion of a crisis is central to the argument. So, and they state things like, 62% of students sometimes don't reach proficient or above, that this is, and that does sound like a crisis. But what's happened in our country is, I'll try not to get too much into the weeds, but the level of reading proficiency has been pretty level for a long period of time. So that if I said to you, basically, the evidence shows that your child reads as well as you read when your child was your age, that sounds a little less like a crisis. I think that, and that's true. Now, can we do better? Sure. We need to do better. We need to work to do better. But I also wanted to look at how we compared with other countries, because if we're in crisis, you would expect these other countries to be really going far ahead of us. And so looking at the various international comparisons, we're doing quite well in reading compared to other countries. I mean, not at the top, but you know, with countries like Canada and Australia and Sweden, you know, kind of in that level, which is, you know, in some ways quite impressive. I think it's good news, and good news is hard to get through because we want to think of our schools in crisis. But it's interesting where the research shows we aren't doing well internationally is in math. So that's, you know, we're typically below the median in math, but well above the median in reading. So is it a crisis? I don't think it's good to think of it as a crisis. I think it's good to think of it, okay, how can we do better? And I think for schools, rather than saying, okay, we need to throw out what we're doing now and take on this new program, I think teachers just get whiplashed by all these changes that occur. I think schools need to say, what are we doing well? What are we doing well? And how can we expand on that? And what are some areas where we can do better? And what resources do we need to do better? Now, that may sound like a boring kind of thinking, you know, but I think that's how you get better. I don't think you get better by, you know, suddenly just turning over everything you've done and taking on something new, because I think teachers feel like there's just this constant pendulum swing, and they're constantly asked to make these changes, and it doesn't really benefit kids, and it doesn't benefit the schools. So I think we need to take maybe a more rational approach to change rather than to think in terms of a crisis.
So the schools internationally who are doing very well in reading, I'd want to know what they're doing.
Yeah. And, you know, I mean, there've been a lot of studies in Finland, and they really value the professionalism of teachers and really promote that. And the last thing I would think, just based on my own reading of work methods in Finland, the last thing they would want to do is to put their teachers in a one-size-fits-all scripted curriculum where they have no latitude to use their own professional judgment. I think that would be an anathema to a program like Sweden.
So with that, I think one of the things that you mentioned is the gap is significant in our country between kids who have access to schools in areas that have more resources than others. You use a Claremont versus where you were president of the school board as one example. Can you talk a little bit about how where kids go to school can impact their reading success?
Well, I think it's a huge determinant. You know, to go back to the international comparisons, you know, in every country, you know, socioeconomic status, you know, correlates with reading performance. But what's interesting about the United States is the gap. That in other countries, the gap is narrower between, say, the bottom quartile and the top quartile. In the United States, it's bigger. So in the United States, the penalty for being poor in reading is greater than the penalty in some of the other countries. It's there for every country. So that that doesn't mean we shouldn't work hard, you know, wait till nirvana comes and, you know, educational opportunities equalize. But I think that the factors of poverty, the way in which, say, a school district like ours could just hire teachers away from the poor districts.
Yep.
You know, like our school district, it's in a university town, very well supported. If we have an opening, we just go to one of the outlying poor districts, Rochester, Farmington. There's some hotshot teacher there. We hire them, and then you create instability. You've taken away a resource from that school. I mentioned in the article, Matthew Desmond talks about poverty in his book Poverty by America. He says that some groups in this country not only tolerate poverty, they benefit from poverty. And a school district like mine benefits from the poverty of other districts because we could pull their teachers away and then create churn in their system while we bring that teacher into our system. So that's like one example just of how how the advantage works to, for the school districts that have some advantage.
It doesn't really even get at the idea that a kid's level of literacy before you even get to kindergarten
Right.
is a strong indicator of where you're going to exit 12th grade.
Mm-hmm. And certainly the vocabulary you have, the word wealth that you have when you come in.
Access to
the
books,
advantage-
access to libraries, access, to
Mhm.
supplies like Penny's daughter making books, all of that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just
Granddaughter.
the conversational skills that you have, the vocabulary, the
Yep.
working vocabulary that you have. Yeah, I mean, there's so many combinations of self-reinforcing advantages that you get being in certain communities that, the stability of marriage. I mean, marriage stability is related to economics as well. I mean, not that they're not divorces among wealthy people for sure, but I mean, there's all kinds of stabilities that you get with relative wealth and all kinds of instabilities you get in poverty, not only in the school, outside the school. And I think those are devastating. And sometimes I read somewhere that we think of kids as kind of adventurous and experimental, but they're real conservatives. I think that change and disruption really can be harmful. Being in emotionally unreliable situations. And I think that's what poverty gives you. And I think that one of the things that bothered me is it's not the 3 queuing system. That's not, I mean, we can talk about that if we want, but it's all these accumulated disadvantages that come with poverty that's, in my view, the cause of this big disruption and our incredible tolerance of poverty in this country.
Tom, for the secondary teachers listening, could you just very briefly explain the 3 queuing system, the criticism of it, and why you don't accept that criticism?
My understanding, I mean, if you go to, say, Sold a Story, the 3 queuing system is presented as the fatal flaw of American reading instruction. And it's presented as a fatal flaw in this material because it treats like sound symbol correspondence is just one way of reading words. And it talks about looking at pictures and using meaning also to figure out words, okay? With the idea that the sound symbol correspondence is the precise, exact, dominant, maybe even exclusive way that you should teach students to figure out words, okay? So the other queuing systems, they often refer to as guessing. Guessing is a big part of what the criticism, you don't want to teach kids to guess, you want to teach kids to be precise, you want to teach kids to analyze the sounds and symbols. Marie Clay would say, you want to give kids a full toolbox to read words. And clearly, sound symbol correspondence, learning the alphabetic principles, important, okay? She doesn't deny that. But she would say meaning, context, figuring out words based on what makes sense, those are also useful tools. And what you want to do is you want to use those in combination, okay? And I'm just going to read to you there's a review of the research by Rob Tierney and David Pearson, fact-checking the science of reading. And I just want to read their conclusion. And I'll read it twice because I think it's so important. Word reading, especially the facile sort that is accurate, automatic, and fluent, cannot be achieved without a repertoire of word-solving skills that help students figure out the pronunciation and meaning of words they cannot immediately recognize or understand. A repertoire of skills. Mm-hmm. So in their view, the 3 queuing system has not been scientifically invalidated. That obviously a kid can use context and make a wild guess, or a kid can look at the picture and make a wild, it doesn't guarantee, but you want all these things working together. So if a kid meets a difficult word, he might begin by sounding it out, and then using meaning might be suddenly the light goes on, he figures out the word, then he might check the word by looking through the rest of the word that he hasn't yet sounded out. So you might have all these working together. Mm-hmm. And that's what Marie Clay, and I think, Tierney and Pearson would say is scientifically validated. So that the claim that the 3 cueing system has been absolutely scientifically invalidated, they would disagree with that.
Mhm.
Okay. So, and that's really an important point to make, that as Marie Clay would argue, and I think Tierney and Pearson, you need a full toolbox. You want to get them all these tools, and you want them working in concert, and that creates a kind of a strategic, you know, powerful reader. So that's, in a nutshell, that's kind of the way I see it.
Wow. I mean, it's just so helpful, Tom, to hear you frame really complex things in language we can all understand. But I don't want people to miss the fact that reading your piece, it's an extended article that really shows the gaps in the thinking behind Sold a Story. And with that, it will help parents, it'll help teachers, it'll help leaders be able to explain it clearly to other stakeholders in their schools. It's a real gift.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I love how you ended it with the H.L. Mencken quote: "For every problem, there is a solution that is simple, neat, and wrong."
Yeah.
Right? It's, you know, we want the simple answer, but that's what I really love about the article is it, in layman's terms, it really breaks down some of the illogic that's fueling the most recent reading movements in the country.
Mhm.
And I think it misrepresents what's actually going on in the country, because if you go into like an elementary school classroom, it looks like a shrine to the alphabet. You know, it's not, it's phonics is being taught. Now you can argue, should be taught more systematically, should be more deliberate. Okay, good questions. But to think that it's not being taught or that certain programs ignore it, I think creates an anxiety and an anger that is unhealthy. And I think the debate right now is kind of unhealthy. I saw a headline that said, "The noose is tightening around certain reading programs." And I thought, the noose is tightening. Where are we talking like this? Why are we talking like this? You know?
A really good point. And I think one of the panics that's happening is that since COVID, we have kids, my daughter teaches 5th grade, who missed a lot of key years in reading. They missed a lot of instruction. And you have teachers who were trained to be middle school teachers, for example, trying to help kids who are barely reading. But we also know that engagement is one of those factors that has a huge impact. If a kid is able to read something that makes them laugh and they're enjoying as opposed to flashcards or, right? It isn't that it's one or the other, but if you don't have a whole menu of things that contribute to a healthy relationship with reading, those kids will feel defeated and will be unwilling to try. And it's just going to take a whole class effort to get our kids back as engaged readers.
And I think we can always start by asking, what can they do? You know, it's not what they can't do. I think we tend to think, oh, this kid's having, but what does this kid know? I mean, does this kid know a lot about sports? Okay, how can we access that? You know, it's kind of similar to what I said about your programs. I mean, don't start, and there's like a scene from Apollo 13 where Gene Kranz is monitoring it, and all the things are falling apart. You know, this doesn't work, and there's oxygen levels dropping, and this. And he asked the question. He says, "What's good?" He says, "What's good?" And it turned out the LEM was functional, and that so he turned the thinking around. And I think sometimes when we have, I mean, in so many ways, we look at what's wrong, what aren't we doing? But what can that kid do? And then how can you build from what that kid can do? Because that kid knows stuff, that kid has his language, that kid has interests. How can we leverage that asset, that fund of knowledge, how can we build on the strength? And I think once you start thinking that way, you're thinking in a different way than we often think about struggling readers.
Comes back to the word we've talked about, differentiation.
Yep. That is just a perfect way to end too, Tom, right? Let's start with, what does this kid know already, right? And Thank you so much. I appreciate you giving us this time so that we can send this out. And I just really hope anyone watching this will use it to inform themselves and to others that are concerned or have questions about what's happening with reading.
Thank you, Tom. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes.
Thanks for the chance.